Here is something that does not get said often enough about 90-day change programs. The time frame is rarely the problem. 90 days is genuinely enough time to shift measurable patterns in how a person works, thinks, and spends their attention. That is not an optimistic claim. It is consistent with what research on habit formation actually shows. The issue is not the calendar. The issue is almost always what happens inside it. The standard approach to any intentional change period goes something like this. A person identifies what they want to be different. They commit to a set of new behaviors. They begin with solid, early consistency. And then, somewhere between week 3 and week 6, the momentum quietly drops. By week 8, the daily patterns have largely returned to their pre-attempt baseline. The person files the experience under, "I tried that," and either restarts with renewed energy or quietly gives up on the direction entirely. This pattern is not about personal weakness. It is not about insufficient desire or poor character. It is a predictable outcome of a structurally flawed approach. And because the approach is the problem rather than the person, changing the approach changes the outcome. What a structurally sound 90-day program actually looks like is different from what most people expect. It starts with removal rather than addition. It treats direction setting as a cognitive tool rather than a motivational exercise. It accounts for the counterintuitive sequence in which identity and behavior actually interact. It builds daily structure that functions independently of motivation. It prepares specifically for the resistance phase that every sustained change attempt goes through. And it closes with consolidation practices that determine whether what was built becomes permanent or gradually dissolves once the defined period ends. Those 6 elements are what this session works through, one at a time, in order, with specific attention to what each one actually requires in practice. A few things worth naming up front. This session is not a promise that 90 days will overhaul everything. That framing overpromises in ways that reliably produce disappointment. What 90 days can produce, when the approach is sound, is a meaningful, documentable shift in specific daily patterns and in the internal sense of what feels normal and what feels possible. That is valuable without needing to be inflated. It is also not a motivational script. The tone throughout is analytical. Not because motivation is irrelevant, but because motivation is temporary. What this session is concerned with is what sustains behavior after motivation has settled to its normal level. And it is designed specifically for people who have already tried, who know what it feels like to begin a change attempt with genuine intention and watch it erode, who are not looking for inspiration. They are looking for a more structurally reliable approach to the next attempt. If that describes where you are coming in, this is the right session. Part 1. Start with removal, not addition. The instinct when beginning any intentional change period is to add things. A new morning routine, a new skill to develop, a new discipline to build. The mental image of a better daily life is almost always an additive one. More structure, more consistency, more of the behaviors that serve the direction you want to move in. That instinct makes sense on the surface. It is also one of the primary reasons change attempts collapse before they get traction. Here's the problem. Every new behavior you introduce has to compete against established ones that have every structural advantage. Familiarity, automaticity, environmental cues that trigger them reliably, and a long reinforcement history that has made them the default. A newly intended behavior, however genuinely committed to, is operating in conditions that were built by years of repetition to sustain entirely different behavior. The competition is not even close. Research on habit formation is consistent here. New behaviors installed in an unchanged environment have a substantially lower consolidation rate than the same behaviors introduced alongside deliberate restructuring of the environment and daily routine. The new behavior needs room to establish itself. Creating that room is the actual first step, not the inspiring one, but the functional one. Creating that room starts with an honest inventory. If a 90-day program requires a meaningful daily investment in skill development, In a new professional practice, in any consistent routine, the time for that investment has to come from somewhere. It does not appear out of nowhere. It comes from a reallocation of time that is currently going elsewhere. Identifying where that time currently goes, specifically rather than approximately, is where the inventory starts. Not, I waste time in the evenings, but a concrete look at what specifically fills the 2 or 3 hours after the workday ends. Not, I could probably find time in the mornings, but an honest assessment of what the morning actually contains and what within it is genuinely fixed versus what is simply habitual. This level of specificity is uncomfortable for a reason. It removes the vagueness that makes avoidance feel comfortable. A person who has not specifically identified where the time for a new commitment will come from has left themselves an invisible exit, the ability to intend the commitment without ever confronting its real cost. Beyond time, the inventory has a second dimension: behavioral obstacles. These are different from time sinks. A behavioral obstacle is an existing pattern that does not just consume time, but actively degrades the conditions the new direction needs to operate in. A practical example. Someone working to build a demanding new professional skill finds that their habitual late evening pattern, irregular, screen-heavy, unpredictable, consistently produces mornings with low cognitive readiness. The evening pattern is not merely competing for time. It is directly undermining the downstream conditions that the skill-building work requires. Trace that connection specifically, and the removal decision changes character. It is no longer a question of willpower or self-denial. It becomes a straightforward operational decision. This pattern produces conditions that work against the stated goal, so addressing it is not optional. It is a prerequisite. Framing removal decisions in those operational terms is more durable than framing them as sacrifices. Sacrifice requires sustained willpower to maintain. An operational decision, made on the basis of clear reasoning, does not need the same ongoing effort. The tool that makes removal decisions stick is written specification. When a decision to reduce or eliminate an existing pattern is documented, the pattern named specifically, the reason articulated in connection to the stated goal, the alternative use of the freed time or attention defined, the decision has a form that can be consulted when the pull toward the old pattern reasserts itself. And it will reassert itself. That is not pessimism. It is the documented reality of what happens when established patterns are disrupted. Researchers describe this temporary intensification as an extinction burst. When an established pattern stops receiving the reinforcement it previously produced, the system that maintained it generates an increased drive to seek that reinforcement before the drive eventually decreases. From the inside, this feels like the removal was a mistake. It is actually evidence that the removal was effective enough to produce a system response. Knowing this in advance, understanding that an intensified pull toward the old pattern in the first week or two after removal is expected and temporary, prevents the most costly misreading of that phase, which is treating the discomfort as a reason to reverse the decision. Two additional elements belong in the initial inventory. First, an honest look at which existing patterns are genuinely non-negotiable versus which merely feel that way. Some patterns feel indispensable simply because they have been consistently present, not because removing them would produce genuine harm. Distinguishing these requires more honest examination than most people give them during a change attempt. Second, a week of actual time tracking before the program begins, rather than estimating from memory. Research on time perception consistently finds that estimated and actual time used diverge significantly. People reliably underestimate time spent in low-value habitual activities and overestimate the time available for intentional ones. A single week of honest tracking produces a realistic picture that estimation simply does not. The removal phase is not where the sense of progress lives, but it is where the conditions for everything that follows are either created or left absent. Clear the actual space first, then build into it. Part 2. Direction as a cognitive tool. Most people treat goal setting as a motivational exercise. You identify what you want, write it down in some form, and use that statement to orient the effort that follows. This is better than operating without any defined direction, but it captures only a portion of what a well-specified direction actually does. And here is where most people miss something important. A clearly specified direction is not primarily a statement of intent. It is a cognitive filtering mechanism. Understanding it that way changes how seriously you take the work of specifying it. Here is how it functions. The human attentional system is selective by necessity. At any given moment, the volume of available input, sensory, environmental, informational, is many times larger than conscious awareness can process. The brain filters this constantly, routing some information toward conscious processing and leaving the rest below the threshold of awareness. One of the things that shapes this filtering is active goal representations. A goal that is specific enough to have concrete, evaluable features creates a reference the brain can actually use. Information relevant to the clearly specified direction gets routed toward awareness more reliably. Opportunities, resources, and useful inputs get noticed. The same information, for someone with only a vague intention, tends to pass through without registering. This is part of why specific goals consistently outperform vague ones in research. Not just because they are more motivating, but because they give the attentional system something functional to filter with. The cognitive resolution improves. Relevant things get noticed that would otherwise be missed. The inverse is equally real. I want to improve professionally, or I want to be healthier, do not provide a specific enough reference to filter effectively. The person may be genuinely committed and still consistently fail to notice the specific inputs that would serve the direction. Not from lack of motivation, from insufficient cognitive resolution in the goal representation itself. So what does sufficient specificity actually look like? A working standard worth applying. A direction is specific enough when you can evaluate any given daily action against it with a clear yes or no. Does this serve the stated direction? If that question regularly requires interpretation, if you find yourself uncertain whether something counts, the direction needs more definition before it can function as a useful cognitive tool. Consider two versions of the same intention. Version 1. Building stronger professional capabilities in a relevant area. Genuine, worth pursuing, but not filterable. Almost any professional activity can be evaluated as consistent with it. Nothing gets prioritized because everything qualifies. Version 2. Within the next 90 days, completing a defined sequence of skill-building work in a specific domain, producing a concrete output at the 30-day and 60-day marks that can be assessed against an external standard. Now there is something to filter against. A given hour can be evaluated clearly. The direction is doing cognitive work. There is a second function of clear direction that matters just as much. It front-loads decision-making. Moving from a vague intention to a clearly specified direction requires making a series of implicit choices explicit. What exactly is the priority? What is not the priority during this period, even if it matters? What does meaningful progress look like at specific intervals? What will this direction require in terms of time, restructured routines, and reduced investment elsewhere? These decisions will need to be made at some point during the 90 days. The question is whether they get made in advance, calmly, without competing pressures, or reactively, in the middle of the program, under conditions of fatigue, disruption, and reduced cognitive capacity. Decisions made under pressure are lower quality. They favor immediate comfort over stated priorities and are more easily reversed when circumstances shift again. Front-loading them during the specification phase, making them explicit, documenting them, treating them as settled, removes a significant source of daily overhead and inconsistency. A practical format for this specification work. Write the direction as a specific outcome, concrete enough to be evaluated at the 90-day mark. Write why that outcome matters in practical terms connected to your actual situation. Not abstract language, but real consequences of achieving or not achieving it. Write what the direction requires as daily or weekly behavior, and write the trade-offs explicitly. What will be reduced or restructured, rather than leaving them implied. This four-component document is more functional than a goal statement. It is an operational brief, something you can return to on the days when the direction feels less clear or the commitment is lower than it was when you started. One final point worth naming directly: how many primary directions to pursue simultaneously? Research on attention and task switching is consistent here. Complex goal-directed thinking does not genuinely run in parallel. What feels like pursuing multiple goals at once is actually a sequence of attentional shifts, each carrying a cognitive cost. For complex skill building or sustained behavioral change, that cost is meaningful. Two directions with divided attention will typically produce less substantive progress than one direction with full allocation, even if both directions genuinely matter. For a 90-day period, choosing one primary direction is a strategic choice, not a permanent constraint. Other priorities can be maintained at current levels and addressed in a subsequent period. One direction, fully specified, treated as settled. That is the cognitive foundation on which the rest of the program is built. Part 3. How identity actually changes. There is a persistent and consequential misconception about how identity and behavior interact during a change attempt. The common assumption runs like this: identity change comes first. A person arrives at a new sense of who they are through reflection, reframing, or a shift in perspective, and behavior then follows from that updated self-concept. This assumption shapes how people approach change. They invest significant effort in thinking differently about themselves, in adopting the internal perspective of the person they want to become, expecting behavioral change to follow naturally. The research runs in the opposite direction. Behavioral change precedes identity change. A person acts differently first, consistently, in a defined direction, over a sufficient period, and the internal sense of identity updates in response to the accumulated evidence of that behavior. The subjective experience of being a different kind of person is downstream of consistent behavioral practice, not a prerequisite for it. This matters practically because it changes what you do first. If identity comes first, the starting point is internal, working on self-perception and self-narrative before acting. If behavior comes first, the starting point is external and specific, defining the behavior, building the conditions for it, and beginning to execute before the internal sense has updated. The second starting point is what the research supports. And here is why that distinction matters so much in practice. In the early weeks of a 90-day program, the person executing the new behavior is doing so without the internal sense of identity that would make the behavior feel natural. It feels effortful in part because it feels slightly artificial, like doing something that does not fully fit the existing self-concept. This experience is nearly universal in the early phase of any significant change attempt, and it is almost universally misread. The common interpretation: the new behavior does not fit. There is a mismatch between the direction and the person pursuing it, and that mismatch is why the behavior feels forced. This interpretation suggests reconsidering the direction or waiting until internal alignment feels more genuine. The more accurate interpretation: the discomfort is the expected experience of identity lagging behind behavior. The behavior has moved ahead of the self-concept update, which is precisely the correct sequence. The discomfort confirms that the sequence is operating as it should. This is not a motivational reframe. It is a more accurate description of what is actually happening. And accurate descriptions produce different responses. Specifically, continued execution rather than the pause or reconsideration that the inaccurate interpretation tends to produce. Here is how the arc plays out across the 90 days. In week 1, the new behavior is fully effortful. There is a clear felt gap between what is being done and the internal sense of self. The person is doing something new, and it feels new, unfamiliar, not fully integrated with how they typically experience themselves. By week 4 or 5, If consistency has been maintained, something begins to shift. Not dramatically. The new behavior has started to become a contextual expectation. The morning session slot now has an established occupant. A day when the behavior does not occur starts to feel slightly incomplete rather than slightly relieving. That is an early identity update signal, produced by the accumulated evidence of consistent behavior over the preceding weeks. By week 9 or 10, with continued consistency, the shift is more pronounced. The behavior has moved from effortful and somewhat foreign towards something closer to normal. The internal sense of self has begun incorporating the pattern as part of its definition. This does not happen all at once. It accumulates incrementally. Understanding this arc changes how the early weeks are navigated. The uncomfortable early phase is a correct phase, not a deviation from the process. There is a related mechanism worth understanding because it reinforces the behavioral first sequence, the role of internal narrative. Research on self-concept has established that people have a documented tendency to act in ways consistent with their existing self-concept, partly as a means of maintaining internal coherence. The self-concept functions as a kind of behavioral prediction. This is how I respond in situations like this. And actual behavior tends to conform to that prediction. This creates a self-reinforcing dynamic that can operate in either direction. If the existing self-concept contains a characterization of the person as someone who does not follow through on extended commitments, that characterization functions as a prediction that makes follow-through more difficult. Not because it is fixed, but because behavior tends toward the prediction. As new behavioral evidence accumulates, the prediction begins to update. The accumulated record of follow-through, specific instances of having maintained the commitment under varying conditions, provides competing evidence against the older characterization. With enough evidence, the prediction shifts. And that shift is the identity change. The practical implication is about internal language during the change period. There is a meaningful difference between characterizing the new behavior as aspirational. I am working on being someone who follows through, and characterizing it as factual. When the committed behavior has been completed on a given day, the most accurate internal description is simply that the work was done, not as self-congratulation, as a factual entry in the behavioral record. Factual records accumulate into evidence. Evidence updates the self-concept prediction. That update is the identity shift. One more dimension worth naming: the social environment. Self-concept is not formed entirely in isolation. It is also shaped by the expectations and behavioral responses of the people in a person's immediate environment. Those people have established models of who the person is and how they behave, models formed before the change period began. And those models can exert a quiet maintaining force on old patterns, simply through the expectations they create. This does not make the social environment an obstacle. It makes it a dimension to navigate consciously rather than ignore. In the early weeks of a change program, the environment's model of the person is out of date. Being aware of this, being deliberate about which external characterizations of behavior are accepted as relevant versus held at a distance, reduces the unexamined effect of those outdated expectations. Behavior first, consistently, in a clearly defined direction. The identity update follows. The early discomfort of that lag is expected, not alarming. Internal language kept accurate and factual supports the evidence accumulation. And the social environment is navigated consciously rather than left to run in the background. Part 4. Building structure that outlasts motivation. In the first week of almost any change attempt, the daily question of whether to follow through is relatively easy to answer. The decision is fresh. The commitment is strong. The novelty of the new behavior still produces a small motivational response of its own. The answer is usually yes, and it does not require much deliberate effort to get there. By week 4, the same question looks entirely different. The novelty has faded. The commitment has been tested by days that did not go according to plan. The answer now depends on something other than the initial motivation, because that motivation is no longer doing the same work it did at the start. And here's where a lot of people get it wrong. The instinctive response to fading motivation is to look for more motivation, to revisit the reasons for the commitment, seek a sense of renewal, find a way to reconnect with the original energy. That response addresses the wrong problem. The thing that sustains behavior after the novelty phase ends is not a stronger form of motivation. It is structure. And structure, once built well, does something motivation never reliably does. It keeps working on the days when the desire to follow through is genuinely low. Structure, in the context of a 90-day program, means the specific, predefined conditions under which the target behavior occurs. A defined time, a defined location or context, a defined trigger, the preceding activity or circumstance that reliably signals that the target behavior is next, and a defined minimum. What constitutes completion on a standard day, and what a reduced but still valid version looks like when full execution is not possible. Research on implementation intentions, the if-then formulations of behavioral plans, has consistently shown that follow-through rates are substantially higher when people specify not just what they intend to do, but when, where, and under what conditions they will do it. The mechanism is that contextual and environmental cues, once associated with the target behavior through repeated pairing, begin initiating the behavior more automatically when those conditions are met. The cognitive load of the initiation decision decreases. The behavior becomes increasingly habitual over time. For a 90-day program, the structure specification needs to address 4 practical questions. First, exactly when does the primary commitment occur? Not a general time window, a specific time, following a specific preceding activity. A vague window is not a trigger. It is an intention that requires a fresh decision each time about exactly when, within the window, the behavior will start. Specific timing eliminates that decision. Second, what specifically constitutes completion? This boundary needs to be clear enough to evaluate without interpretation. A target output, a defined duration, or a specific quality standard, something that makes the difference between done and not done unambiguous. Vague completion criteria create room for ongoing renegotiation. And renegotiation is one of the primary mechanisms of gradual erosion. Third, what happens when standard conditions are not available? This question needs an answer before the program starts, not improvised when disrupted conditions first appear. Travel, illness, schedule disruptions, and unexpected demands are not exceptional occurrences across 90 days. They are predictable ones. The minimum viable commitment, the reduced but genuine form of the behavior that keeps the sequence intact, should be defined specifically in advance. Fourth, what does the daily review look like? Research on self-regulation and sustained goal pursuit consistently identifies behavioral monitoring as a significant factor in long-term consistency. People who regularly and specifically review their follow-through, with attention to what was done, what was not, and what the gap represents, maintain consistency more durably than people who do not. The daily review does not need to be lengthy. 5 to 10 minutes at a consistent time, answering 3 specific questions in writing. Was the defined commitment met today? If not, what specifically prevented it, and what does that indicate? What does tomorrow's execution look like given what today produced? Writing matters here. Unwritten review is subject to memory biases that affect all retrospective self-assessment, including the well-documented tendency to evaluate past consistency more favorably than the actual record supports. Written records are not subject to the same revision. They provide an honest baseline that prevents the gradual drift in perceived performance that purely internal tracking produces. The physical environment is also worth addressing directly. Research on environmental cues and behavioral initiation establishes that the arrangement of the physical and digital environment shapes how behaviors start and sustain, often in ways that operate outside conscious decision-making. Cues that reliably preceded old behaviors maintain their triggering function even when those behaviors have been targeted for change. Arrangements that reduce the friction of initiating the target behavior and increase the friction of competing ones produce meaningful differences in consistency. Not because they increase motivation, but because they work on the initiation decision rather than the will behind it. Practically, the workspace for the primary commitment should be arranged specifically for that purpose and ready without setup time at the start of each session. Devices and applications that are primary cues for competing behaviors should not be present during commitment time. Materials needed for the commitment should be visible and accessible before the session begins. These are not complex changes, but they work at the most friction-heavy point in the behavioral sequence, the moment of initiation, and their effect on follow-through is consistently larger than their apparent simplicity suggests. One final element: building in defined review points for the structure itself, not just for the behavior. At the 30-day and 60-day marks, the structure deserves specific evaluation. Is the defined commitment producing movement toward the stated direction? Does the completion standard need adjustment? Have competing behaviors found their way back into the commitment context? The structure serves the direction, and ensuring it continues to do so requires periodic honest assessment rather than treating it as fixed once established. Part 5. The resistance phase and how to read it accurately. Between the third and sixth week of most sustained change programs, something predictable happens. Maintaining the consistent behavior becomes noticeably more difficult. Not because external circumstances have necessarily changed. Not because the direction has become less relevant. The effort required increases because the change process has reached a specific phase with a specific mechanism behind it. Understanding that mechanism, precisely rather than emotionally, is one of the more practically significant things a person can do before starting a 90-day program. Here is what is actually happening during this phase. Every established behavioral pattern has what researchers describe as a reinforcement history, a record of having produced some form of reward, however small or indirect, across repeated instances. That history is what built the pattern into its current form, and it continues to function as a maintaining force even when the person is actively trying to displace it. When a change program redirects the time, attention, and environmental conditions that previously went to established behaviors toward new ones, the displaced patterns do not simply go quiet. The systems that maintain them continue seeking the conditions under which they were previously reinforced. Initially, this seeking is not dramatically more intense than it was before. But as the displacement continues and the previous reinforcement consistently does not materialize, the drive to seek it intensifies before it eventually decreases. This temporary intensification is what researchers call an extinction burst. It is well documented in behavioral research, and it has a characteristic timing. It tends to occur in the weeks following consistent displacement of the old behavior. Once the new pattern has been maintained long enough for the old reinforcement to be reliably absent. From the inside, an extinction burst feels like evidence that the change is not working. The increased pull toward old patterns gets read as confirmation that those patterns are stronger, that the new approach is not sustainable, or that something about the program is fundamentally wrong. These interpretations are consistently inaccurate. The intensified pull toward old patterns is not evidence that they are winning. It is evidence that they have been sufficiently displaced to generate a system response. In a specific sense, the intensity of the extinction burst is proportional to how effectively the displacement has occurred. Reading the signal accurately rather than emotionally changes what follows. Someone who reads the intensification as evidence of failure responds by reducing effort, tolerating more exceptions, and reconsidering the direction. Shows they are not. That gap between how the phase feels and what it actually represents is where most programs end, and that ending is almost always premature. 3 practical preparations for this phase are worth building into the program structure in advance. The first is expectation setting. Research on stress and performance consistently shows that anticipated difficulty produces less behavioral disruption than unexpected difficulty, even when the objective difficulty level is identical. Simply knowing, before the program begins, what the resistance phase is, when it is likely to occur, and what it mechanistically represents removes a significant portion of its disorienting effect. Writing this down as part of the program setup means it is available to consult when the phase arrives. The second is a pre-specified response protocol, not a general intention to push through. That is too vague to provide reliable guidance when motivation is low and the pull toward old patterns is strong. A specific written protocol. What will be done on a day when maintaining the commitment feels particularly difficult? This might be an automatic default to the minimum viable commitment. It might be reviewing the written direction specification and its documented reasons. Whatever the specific protocol is, its function is to provide a pre-made decision that does not require fresh deliberation in the moment when deliberation is most degraded. The third is an explicit commitment to maintain the written behavioral record through this specific phase. The record during the resistance phase is the most valuable record in the entire 90-day period. It contains the evidence of follow-through under the most challenging conditions. It is also the part of the record most likely to be abandoned or approximated when the phase is hard. Pre-committing to maintaining it specifically during this phase ensures the evidence it produces is available for the consolidation that follows. There is a social dimension to this phase that compounds its difficulty in a specific way. The people in a person's immediate environment have expectations formed by patterns they have observed over time. Those expectations do not update in real time. During the resistance phase, when the internal pull toward old behavior is strongest, the social environment's expectations are still largely reflecting the old patterns. The convergence of internal pull and external expectation, both pointing in the same direction, amplifies the difficulty beyond what either factor produces independently. Being aware of this in advance allows for deliberate management of social context during the most demanding weeks. Being more selective about which environments are engaged, being clear internally about which external characterizations are accepted as relevant, and maintaining the distinction between others' outdated models and the behavioral record actually being built. The resistance phase is not the end of the 90-day program. Experientially, it can feel that way. Structurally, it is the middle. Getting through it with the behavioral sequence intact and the written record maintained is the specific transition that separates programs that consolidate into lasting change from programs that reverse at their most difficult point. Part 6. Making what you built actually last. The final phase of a defined change program is where the preceding weeks either become something durable or gradually unravel. This is usually not a sudden reversal. It is gradual, and it often begins before the 90-day period officially concludes. Understanding why it happens and what structural choices prevent it is the practical focus of this closing section. The mechanism is connected to how the cognitive system responds to defined time frames. When a commitment is structured within a finite period, the psychological relationship to that commitment shifts as the end of the period approaches. Behavioral research on temporal discounting, the tendency to assign lower value to future outcomes as they move closer to a defined endpoint, has a parallel in how people relate to upcoming behavioral commitments. As the 90-day mark approaches, the urgency that characterized the earlier weeks begins to decrease. The implicit logic, operating mostly below conscious awareness, is that the period is almost over, so the standard of execution in the final days does not need to match what it was earlier. The behavioral consequence is a documented drop in consistency in the final 10 to 15 days of many time-defined programs. Exactly when consolidation is most critical. The practical response is to reframe the 90-day mark before it arrives. Specifically, establish in advance that the end of the period is a review point rather than a completion point. A completion frame signals that the activity is finished. A review frame signals that this is a transition between defined periods, not a terminus. The implication is that what is done in the final days directly shapes the starting conditions of the next period. This reframing is most effective when it is made explicit in the 6th or 7th week, early enough to influence the behavioral orientation of the final 3 or 4 weeks, rather than at the point when the discounting effect is already well underway. The review at the 90-day mark needs to address several specific questions. What specifically has changed since the beginning? In behavior, in measurable output, and in the internal sense of what is normal. An honest inventory of actual change, documented specifically rather than approximated, serves two functions simultaneously. It provides an accurate baseline for the next period. And it makes the identity level shift visible and explicit, because shifts that happen gradually are often underregistered by the person experiencing them. Here is something that does not get said often enough about 90-day change programs. The time frame is rarely the problem. 90 days is genuinely enough time to shift measurable patterns in how a person works, thinks, and spends their attention. That is not an optimistic claim. It is consistent with what research on habit formation actually shows. The issue is not the calendar. The issue is almost always what happens inside it. The standard approach to any intentional change period goes something like this. A person identifies what they want to be different. They commit to a set of new behaviors. They begin with solid, early consistency. And then, somewhere between week 3 and week 6, the momentum quietly drops. By week 8, the daily patterns have largely returned to their pre-attempt baseline. The person files the experience under, "I tried that," and either restarts with renewed energy or quietly gives up on the direction entirely. This pattern is not about personal weakness. It is not about insufficient desire or poor character. It is a predictable outcome of a structurally flawed approach. And because the approach is the problem rather than the person, changing the approach changes the outcome. What a structurally sound 90-day program actually looks like is different from what most people expect. It starts with removal rather than addition. It treats direction setting as a cognitive tool rather than a motivational exercise. It accounts for the counterintuitive sequence in which identity and behavior actually interact. It builds daily structure that functions independently of motivation. It prepares specifically for the resistance phase that every sustained change attempt goes through. And it closes with consolidation practices that determine whether what was built becomes permanent or gradually dissolves once the defined period ends. Consider two versions of the same intention. Version 1. Building stronger professional capabilities in a relevant area. Genuine, worth pursuing, but not filterable. Almost any professional activity can be evaluated as consistent with it. Nothing gets prioritized because everything qualifies. Version 2. Within the next 90 days, completing a defined sequence of skill-building work in a specific domain, producing a concrete output at the 30-day and 60-day marks that can be assessed against an external standard. Now there is something to filter against. A given hour can be evaluated clearly. The direction is doing cognitive work. There is a second function of clear direction that matters just as much. It front-loads decision-making. Moving from a vague intention to a clearly specified direction requires making a series of implicit choices explicit. What exactly is the priority? What is not the priority during this period, even if it matters? What does meaningful progress look like at specific intervals? What will this direction require in terms of time, restructured routines, and reduced investment elsewhere? These decisions will need to be made at some point during the 90 days. The question is whether they get made in advance, calmly, without competing pressures, or reactively, in the middle of the program, under conditions of fatigue, disruption, and reduced cognitive capacity. Decisions made under pressure are lower quality. They favor immediate comfort over stated priorities and are more easily reversed when circumstances shift again. Front-loading them during the specification phase, making them explicit, Documenting them, treating them as settled, removes a significant source of daily overhead and inconsistency. A practical format for this specification work. Write down what the period actually produced, not just in terms of external outcomes, but in terms of internal evidence. What can be done now that could not be done at the start? What daily decisions are made more automatically? What does the internal characterization of capability and consistency include now that it did not 90 days ago? This documentation serves the identity consolidation function discussed in the third part of this session. Shifts that happen incrementally are often invisible from the inside. Making the cumulative shift explicit in writing, with specific examples from the actual behavioral record, anchors the updated self-concept more durably than leaving it unexamined. The social dimension of the final phase has also shifted from what it was in the earlier weeks. The people in the immediate environment have been observing the new patterns across the duration of the program. Their models have updated, not completely, not uniformly, but meaningfully. The social expectations that were aligned with old patterns in the early weeks are now, to a greater degree, reflecting the new ones that have been consistently observed. What was a source of friction in the early phase is now a form of reinforcement. The environment is, to a meaningful extent, expecting the new behavior. Maintaining consistency within those social contexts keeps that expectation active and working in the right direction. To close this session, a 90-day change program, structured and executed well, produces something specific and documentable. Not a complete personal transformation. That framing was never realistic and never necessary. Something more precise and more durable. A set of behavioral patterns that are more established, a cognitive infrastructure that makes continued development in the defined direction more accessible, and an internal sense of capability and consistency built from actual behavioral evidence rather than intention. The time within any 90-day period is fixed. What gets built inside it is the only variable that is genuinely under active control. That variable is enough.